First of all, thank you to the participants for signing up and for joining and for showing your interest. We've actually been quite flattered by the interest in this webinar, and hope that this is the first conversation. We appreciate this is a bit more of a one-sided conversation that we would like with you as the audience, but hopefully it's the first of many, and we really encourage you to engage with us after this webinar if this is a topic that's of interest and you'd like to engage with anyone here. What can you expect today? So first, we're going to kick off with Takunda, who you'll hear me call TK quite a bit, who will give us a brief overview of the ever-evolving financial situation in Zimbabwe, which will probably be the most riveting history lesson of your life. Full of surprises always. Then that will be followed by a panel discussion, which will take approximately 30 minutes. And that panel discussion will be broken up into two topics. The first topic will be on digital payments and digital payment solutions in Zimbabwe. What does the landscape look like? Who are the main players? What is the differentiation and distinction between these players? What are the wider implications for the economy? How is Zimbabwe unique in its digital payment solutions? And then the second part of the conversation will focus on international payments with a special focus on remittances, which make up a massive part of the GDP of Zimbabwe. And so just something that it cannot be overlooked. And I think there are a lot of interesting inferences to make from that. We'll then open it up to Q&A. So we do encourage everyone to submit their questions. And we thank everyone who has submitted their questions so far in signing up to this webinar. This is going to be recorded. So if you have to drop off early, no problem at all. We will post the recording on our website, zofafrica.org, and then we'll share the recording later this week by email. So I will introduce our wonderful panelists today, starting with Nyasha. Nyasha is a young and incredibly impressive entrepreneur and software developer. She's the founder of Zenali, which is a marketplace to fund startups in Zimbabwe. She's the host of the podcast Zimbabweans, What's Next, where she interviews founders and recent graduates on how to tackle a professional career in Zimbabwe. So she really comes to the table with a more grassroots and entrepreneur lens to this discussion. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Dumi, who brings a much more macro perspective into this discussion. He's the founder of NABLA Africa, which is a consultancy that advises large multinationals on development and digitalization in Africa. And finally, we have Takunda, TK, who's really at the nexus of innovation and enterprise. He has helped run Microsoft's digital skilling program across sub-Saharan Africa, and he's the founder of the Village Innovation Network, which helps build the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Zimbabwe. He is also a ZOF Africa trustee. I will be moderating today's panel. I am Georgina. My background is in venture capital. I volunteer for ZOF Africa. ZOF Africa is an entirely volunteer-run organization. It is a charity that's registered in the UK and the US, and we fund tech and leadership courses for low-income students with incredibly high potential in Zimbabwe. I am actually currently setting up a new company to place tech talent in Africa into remote roles in Europe. So if that's of interest to anyone who joins today, please reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. Right. So first, I'm going to start off with a quiz to our participants. We would like to assess your level of knowledge on the current situation in Zimbabwe. I also ask for a little bit of slack today. This is my very first time hosting a webinar on Zoom. So if there are any technical glitches, please forgive me. Right. Here we go. Please answer the question. Gosh, we have some experts in the room, everyone. Interesting. Okay. I will give you guys another 5 seconds and then I'm going to end the poll. All right, thank you, everyone. So the correct answer is 22,000. This is the informal rate. So for those of you who answered 18,000, that is the current formal currency exchange rate with the US dollar. And I think just one note about the discrepancy between the informal rate and the formal rate in Zimbabwe. It opens up a debate around trust. Now, trust drives financial systems around the world, but it plays a particularly important role in Zimbabwe. In a way, the lack of trust in the formal system drives this discrepancy, but the discrepancy itself drives the need for trust in the market. So on one hand, it drives the need for people to trust the information they get about the informal rate. And access to information is not equal. And so there is a need to trust the information that you're getting about how much you're going to pay for something. But on the flip side, it's also eroding trust in a lot of times, because if you are a player who can buy at the formal rate and then sell at the informal rate, then why wouldn't you? And the more you do that, the more you erode trust in the system. And so this question of trust has actually come up quite a bit amongst myself and the panelists. And I'm going to invite all the panelists to please continue to bring this up throughout the conversation today, because I just think it's just such an interesting twist, and it's so interconnected with the topic of today's discussion. So without further ado, TK, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Georgina. It's very interesting that you brought up the issue of trust. Let me just remove the survey here. So I know my task right now is to summarize the evolution of our economy and financial services over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think if I were to do justice to that, I would need a couple of hours on this webinar to really touch on everything that happened. But I'm going to try and summarize this very, very quickly. I'm going to break down kind of these comments into 3 time periods. So the first one being from the 90s to about 2008, and then from 2009 to about 2016, and then 2017 to 2024. So this first period, really, I think almost anybody who knows Zimbabwe knows about this time. This is when our inflation hit an all-time record of, I think, over 89 sextillion%. I do not even know how to write down that actual number. The reasons why we got there are myriad. Some are macroeconomic policy issues. Some point to the government sort of letting the printing press loose, so creating a lot of money, devaluing the currency in itself. But it presented a lot of challenges. When I speak to my parents, for example, they tell me how around this time, this is kind of when they lost most of their savings, all of the investment instruments that they had. Savings for people like myself to be able to go to university, and it was quite a tragedy. Around, I think, 2006, all the way to 2009, actually, we redenominated, or we devalued the currency about 3 times. I think the first time we removed 3 zeros, and then the second time, I believe, we removed 6 zeros, all in a bit to try and manage this inflation. In 2017, government declared inflation illegal. And, in fact, changing the price of goods was also in itself illegal, which I think created a lot of commotion. I think around the same time, because of this loss of trust in the currency, we saw a lot of migration of value into commodities. I remember, I think I was in high school at the time, and at the very beginning, we actually paid our school fees using fuel coupons because they're denominated in US dollars. And from there, I think we saw the move largely across the entire system towards the adoption of a multi-currency regime. So this kind of first period was really about the challenges within the formal structures, the formal systems, just the erosion of value, and people trying to figure out how to to catch up with this, trying to access services in a currency that just wasn't usable anymore. So once we adopted this multi-currency regime, I think we effectively suspended the Zimbabwean dollar in 2009 and later demonetized it in 2015. We started using multiple currencies. The US dollar, of course, was the preferred legal tender, although in the southern part of the country, we also the usage of the rand, which I think kind of helped to restore value. But I think this loss of trust meant a lot of people weren't as willing to move this money into the formal banking system. Everybody was banking in quotes under the mattress. So the mattress bank became a very, very common sort of financial system, if I should call it that. Around 2016 or around that time, I think government then tried to reintroduce the Zimbabwean dollar. I believe it was called a bond note at the time. We created a good number of different financial instruments that we were using. And interestingly, this was pegged at 1:1 with the United States dollar. And interestingly, this was not the first time that we did this. In the 1970s, when we moved from the Rhodesian currency, the Zimbabwean dollar was initially pegged at 1:1 with the US dollar. And immediately, this saw the creation of the parole market because, whilst you could say this formally, we all knew that the value of the US dollar was significantly more. And this created arbitrage opportunities. And now because this new dollar, some will call it the RTGS dollar, we kind of saw the creation of new balances within the financial services system as well. And so in retaliation to this, banks started separating US dollar balances. So any balances or any transactions that came in from remittances from outside the country, from exports, you were able to access that in cash. But anything that was from local transactions, local trade, it became a challenge to try and access this, which only fueled the arbitrage opportunity, this perceived differences in values. Again, over the period of, up until around 2016, 2017, government tried to combat this in multiple ways. People were using old mutual shares, I believe, which were trading in multiple countries as a way of determining the true value. And so the trading of those shares was suspended, all in a bid to try and reduce this rapid devaluing that was happening of the newly introduced currency. And I think all of these activities, these were attempts to try and restore trust, to restore value within the national payments infrastructure in terms of finances. But it also had challenges. At the same time, I think a lot of Zimbabweans were starting to participate in transactions online, resulted or found themselves not being able to access a lot of services. So being able to use PayPal, for example, became very difficult. Even attempts to make transactions into the country from other traditional financial institutions in other countries also became quite a challenge. So on one end, you have a lot of people that are trying to participate in the global economy, but are unable to access the rails, the infrastructure to enable them to do so. And then on the other end, you also have a myriad of valuations of the newly introduced local currency and the use of multiple currencies all at the same time. It was a very, very fascinating time. Around, I think, was it 2019, I think, government eventually outlawed the multi-currency system, but then reintroduced it a year later, just at the start of the COVID pandemic. So that was also quite interesting in itself. At the same time, we'd seen the rapid adoption of cryptocurrencies in Zimbabwe. There were very interesting use cases for it. So Zimbabwe imports a lot of ex-Japanese cars from Japan. And so companies like B4 that are the major players in this space were accepting Bitcoin as a payment. And so Zimbabweans started using Bitcoin as a way of moving value and making these purchases, owing to all the benefits of crypto in terms of low transactional fees. Obviously, the ability to access the infrastructure in terms of payments was a challenge. So we saw the price of Bitcoin in Zimbabwe skyrocket well, above the global price. And I remember at the time, friends across the world were reaching out to me saying, look, how can we get into this? How do we, can we move Bitcoin to you right now so that you can quickly transact? And I would be like, sure, we can do that. But the challenge then becomes, how do you get your money out? I already sort of pointed to the infrastructural challenges that were there. In 2018, I believe, the single cryptocurrency exchange that had been set up called Golix was in effect shut down by the central bank. It wasn't a direct mandate per se. It was simply an instruction to all the banks to not facilitate transactions for the exchange, which meant that people didn't have a way of, cashing out any money if they used the exchange. And so this frustrated a lot of people who were beginning to use, cryptocurrencies, who were beginning to trade. It was a very big challenge. And I think a lot of the policies that we saw being introduced at the time were really the government trying to bolster the use of the Zimbabwean dollar and trying to retain value. I think as one of those policies, government introduced a mandatory liquidation, which meant that if you received money as a business from outside the country, say you exported tobacco, for example, a percentage of that would immediately be converted to Zimbabwean dollars at the formal exchange rate, and then you'd be able to receive the balance of it. The percentage of this retention changed on a year-to-year basis, and I think for some industries, this is still in effect. I think there's a flat percentage of 75% that you're able to take out. On top of that, you had 60 days to utilize the US dollars that you've received, otherwise they would automatically be converted to our local currency. So you can imagine, this was creating a lot of havoc. There was the introduction of the auction system for you to be able to access US dollars, but that in itself was also a very big challenge. And I think around the same time, we also saw a good number of interesting innovations. So the government, acknowledging that, people needed a certain store of value, introduced the gold coin, which I think we will talk about in our discussion. And then later on also introduced the gold-backed digital currency, which I think is an interesting innovation, which I know my colleagues will touch on as we have this conversation. And around the same time, I think when it comes to innovation, the central bank launched the FinTech Regulatory Sandbox, which I felt was a really interesting step forward. But we really haven't seen any innovations or any products coming out of this. I think there were just below 200 applications for this into the sandbox, but I'm not sure what is kind of coming out of that. I think around the same time, around this period leading to 2024, remittances began to play a very big role as a source of real USD. And I think more importantly, we started to see the interest in wanting to move money within Zimbabwe, but outside the formal banking system. So there was the significant rise of local remittance services, which I think provided the basis for a lot of innovation and a lot of the players that we're going to be talking about during this panel kind of session. We also saw banks start to introduce new US dollar denominated accounts for those people who had Zimbabwean dollar accounts in a bid to kind of respond to what I believe was the re-dollarization of sort of the economy. Due to this lack of trust and inaccessibility of services, we started to see a lot of peer-to-peer based exchange systems. So I think on the slide there, we have a good number of messages. These are screenshots from communities on platforms like WhatsApp, on Telegram, where people have balances in different wallets in different accounts. So people, with a PayPal balance looking for US dollars in EcoCash, or, looking for US dollars in Inbucks, or vice versa. We have people also looking for cryptocurrency, trying to find a way to make this exchange possible. And I think this presents an interesting context for the notion of trust, because now you're dealing with individuals. There is no regulation to guide or protect your transaction. It is truly you believing in the fact that the person that you're going to transact with is going to fulfill the transaction, and everybody kind of continues going. And these peer-based exchanges have become quite popular. I believe everybody understands the challenge that is there within the system, and for the system to continue, everybody has to play fairly. So I think that's one interesting sort of evolution, and I think it's a basis for a conversation around the innovation in financial services going into the future. I think now we stand at a point where we have a lot of remittances, we have a lot of players, we have the use of the multi-currency system, which was initially pegged to run until the year 2025. And then was extended to the year 2030. So there is at least that proclamation. And this presents a lot of interesting opportunities for people to build services, build innovations, build solutions that address the needs of people within Zimbabwe in a situation where trust has become, in and of itself, a currency. I know I have not done justice to this history because there's a lot that happened, but I'm hoping that this can provide a background for us to have a conversation and hopefully answer questions from our audience as well.
I love the trust as a currency. I also don't know if at the end of this hour, people are going to be more confused, or if things are going to be clear. Like, the more I dig into this, the more confused I get. Thanks so much.
It was a bit of a speed run.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need like 10 hours to cover all of that in like minimal detail. Right. So TK very kindly covered a lot of topics there at quite a high level. I am again going to launch, this time it's not a quiz, it's just a survey to hear from you as participants. Which of the topics TK mentioned would you like to hear more about during the discussion? So let me... Hold on. This is me just now being a millennial and struggling with technology. That's right. Here we go. So if everyone could kindly look at their screen and answer which topic they would like to hear most about. Panelists, can you just put your thumb up or down if you can see the results or you cannot see the results? Okay, great, good. Wonderful. So most people would like to hear about the FinTech sandbox. TK, if you could make sure that you cover that and bring that back up in the conversation, that would be great. And let me write these down so that I don't forget either. So, FinTech sandbox, re-dollarization of the economy. And then the third is crypto. Super. Great. So we'll come back to those in the course of the discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. Can everyone see the results when I do this? Great. And super. All right, let's kick off. So the first topic is we're going to delve into digital payments. And we're just defining digital payments, generally speaking, as financial transactions via a digital channel. So whether that's mobile, internet banking, QR codes, USSD, you name it, that covers it. Nyasha, could I turn to you to just give the audience just a bit of an overview of the space? I think you're going to focus a little bit more on peer-to-peer digital channels, but just tell us kind of what's going on, please.
Yes, and I just want to say TK gave a very great introduction, a very great history of all that happened in Zim that I'm like, did we really go through all of this? So yeah, I was born when all of that stuff was happening, so it's hard to imagine. But I'm going to talk about some of the players that did take advantage of the economic situation and what was happening in Zimbabwe. So I'll go back to the period that TK was talking about, dollarization around 2009, 2010, 2011. So when we had now dollarized, it did help to solve hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. But what was happening now is that there was not a lot of foreign currency coming into the country. So there were severe cash shortages. So that's when we now see the emergence of mobile solutions. And actually, a fun fact is Econet, which is now a very big player in that market, wasn't the first to actually come up with the solutions. I think it was Net1 and Telecel. But Econet was able to really bank on the trust that they had established with their customers and just have good execution, good market research, and good customer service with their products to the end where mobile money was really helpful in that people didn't have to stand in those long queues for the banks. They could just, the money that they get from their salary, they can use it to pay fees. Again, they can use it for peer-to-peer transfers. And so to show you how big it became, at its peak, EcoCash in 2017 had 6.6 million active users. So I just want you to try to imagine how that compares to how many users had bank accounts. So that was actually 2 million. So now you can see how banks had slowed to keep up with what was happening with mobile money. And at this point, EcoCash had penetrated the financial services market even more. So then fast forward, there is a new solution that emerged. I think it was about around 2020, 2021. So this is a funny thing that I always tell some of my friends here in the US where I'm based, is that Zimbabwe, no matter how bad the economy is, there's always going to be a long line at Chicken Inn. So for people who don't know what Chicken Inn is, it's one of the big food outlets that are owned by Simbisa Brands. So Simbisa Brands owns like Baker's Inn, Chicken Inn, like Creamy Inn, and all other fast food outlets that people love. And so what was happening is that people were going to buy their takeaways and they didn't have change. And what would happen typically is if someone is going to buy something there and they need change, they already know they're going to probably ask for a bottle of water they don't want, or they're gonna get some sweets as change or whatever. So to solve that, Inbox said, okay, you know what? If you have change, we're going to put that value into our Inbox wallet, and you can use that money next time on your next visit. And then it evolved into, okay, you can even put money into this wallet and you can use it to buy those takeaways, even for yourself or for other people. And then it evolved to, okay, now you can transfer that money to someone else and pay for them. And then you could also cash in, cash out the money. And then ultimately Inbox just, now it even offers loans to people as well, which is something EcoCash does as well. But one of the big selling points for it is the fact that there are so many food outlets around the country. And when banks are now closed for business, a lot of food outlets are open until 10 p.m., which helps with convenience. And then we move on to most recently, we've had Old Mutual's Omari. And basically, you know, I think from a consumer perspective, you're thinking, okay, another payment service, great. Like, what's in it for me? And then what they're doing is they're offering micro insurance. So for as little as 90 cents, people can get, from 90 cents a month, you can buy an insurance package where people can get food, groceries in the, you know, unfortunate event that you die. And there's also another package to pay school fees. And I think what some of these players are doing is there are so many new players coming in. So the best way they can really draw their customers is to say, okay, we have become the one-stop shop. So you can pay fees through this, you can get insurance, you can pay other bills, you can do peer-to-peer transfers, you can buy airtime. And in that way, a person just knows, okay, Omari is my one stop to get everything done. But and then on the bottom left side is CBZ Ziki Cash, which I think is an interesting case to show that, you know, even traditional banks are now moving into the fintech space. And if they don't have their own digital payment services, they are, you know, starting to have their own wallets as well, or partner with remittance companies. And I think one thing I want to draw about these 4 companies in general is, as we can see, they're owned by big companies that already have a lot of capital. So then the question is, what happens to these new entrepreneurs who want to come in and start something new? Obviously, there's the fintech sandbox, which is saying, okay, come in with your ideas. We are going to test it out. We are going to see if we can adjust the regulations to, you know, to kind of support you in your journey. But is the money enough? I do want to say that there's a government agency called Potras, which I think the T of it stands for telecommunications. So it's very involved in this. And it actually holds an annual hackathon, one of which I actually participated in. And if you have a digital innovation startup, whatever, you go through the hackathon and you can actually win money to start your business. So
And
just wanted to say.
This is fascinating because all of these new players are coming and they're emerging actually quite quickly, but they're all backed by quite large organizations. And sorry, I can't remember if you said, but Omari is backed by Old Mutual.
Yes.
So there's a lot of innovation in the space, but there's a lot of money driving that innovation.
Right.
There's a lot of talk about supporting tech entrepreneurs and tech talent, of which we know Zimbabwe has actually quite a lot of tech talent, and it is good, high quality tech talent. But what is the reality? Like, are there opportunities for them to set up new things, or actually are they just competing with giants and they're fighting a losing battle?
Right. That's why I was mentioning Potras, where there are some government-sponsored agencies where they're trying to, start these hackathons where, entrepreneurs can participate and get some capital. But there definitely still is a need for capital because, as we know, the banking system is not the same as it used to be. So if you want capital for your business, it could be 15% interest rates going upwards. So I think there's definitely a need for talent. And so, yeah.
And maybe actually then I turn the question to TK, who has been working very closely with the innovation ecosystem in Zimbabwe. And I think you really have your finger on the pulse, as I said earlier, TK, on kind of what's happening from a macro perspective, but then also like what are the realities on the ground? How do you see genuine innovation and the opportunities given to young tech workers who may want to be innovating in the space?
So I think it's a complicated question to answer, and I'll also invite Dumi to add his views here. So yes, organizations like Potras have the innovation drive, which is a fund that's supposed to provide capital for innovations. We also have the state universities that have set up their own innovation hubs. We are seeing a good number of the banks setting up their own innovation hubs as well, with the mandate being to stimulate innovation and new product development. That being said, I think the biggest challenge that we have within the ecosystem is, to start with, a lack of coordination. It's very difficult within the Zimbabwean ecosystem for you to map an innovation hub or an entrepreneurship support organization that focuses on a particular sector or a particular stage of the venture building process, and then to be able to figure out where ventures are supposed to go from there to the next. Everybody is running an incubation program or in quotes an acceleration program. And they are really just all of these things. And we're not seeing the ventures really coming out of there. When you look at the new entrants, even in the innovation space from a financial, digital payments or financial services space, most of those startups or SMEs now didn't really come out of an innovation hub. They simply came out of wherever they were working from. And even those that did come out of innovation hubs went on to grow in and of themselves without the support that is supposed to be there within the ecosystem. And I think that lack of coordination is a very, very big challenge. Dumi, I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you, TK, that currently in Zim, we do have pockets of excellence. And we've got various stakeholders who pretty much have good intentions, but the lack of a coordinated ecosystem is definitely affecting the growth of our startup or tech entrepreneurs, be it looking at the aspect of access to capital. And I know when we look at remittances, when I'll speak to it, there's a question to then say, where should these tech startups be raising their capital from? And to what extent can we create an opportunity around the remittances that are inflowing into the country to create that pool of funds? So I think there is actually an opportunity to coordinate our ecosystem, to bring together these pockets of excellence to support, the growth of it thereof. But yeah, 100% agreed.
It's interesting that you use the word coordination, because when I first hear that, I'm like, yeah, but like we live in a we ultimately are all capitalists at heart, and we all want to compete, right? And we talk about coordination in every market, and at the end of the day, everyone's out for themselves. But in listening to you speak, what I'm hearing is that it's not about a lack of coordination so much as it sounds like it's a broken value chain. And from my VC background, I see this a lot. Like often, and I've been investing mainly in developed markets, and you have one solution that fits really neatly into a fully developed value chain. So it's fine. Like you find that you realize it's the same pain point everywhere, but like everything else just kind of like rolls out like a red carpet in front of you. And from what I'm hearing in Zimbabwe, the problem is you'll be like, oh my gosh, this is a massive problem. And so you look to address that, but then you're like, oh my gosh, but like this is so expensive, and like this doesn't exist. And actually, like this whole value chain is not set up for me to succeed. And like I can't, my business, I'm supposed to be focusing, and I'm not going to just like fix the whole value chain because then I'm going to be too fragmented as a business. So if I understand correctly, it's a bit of a fragmentation around the value chain. And if that's correct, it would be great to hear a little bit more. And Nyasha, I know that you've had these problems. You talked about this in an earlier call when you were setting up Zenali. And I've understood that you were setting up this, you were capitalizing on an opportunity to channel more funds from abroad into promising businesses in Zimbabwe, but you felt this this rupture in the value chain. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about like what are the specific pain points of the value chain, because maybe one of the kind of takeaways from this webinar is, okay, well, actually we've got like these 3 points of the value chain. And so in terms of a better coordination, these are the 3 that if everyone addresses, we could actually have a really robust value chain, and then people can focus along that value chain.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say quickly that in terms of the fintech sandbox, I think once you do a little more research, you can find some companies that are coming out of it. I think in general, the central bank could do a better job in listing the companies, but I don't know if any of you have heard of Uhuru or Lloyd crowdfunding. But when I was doing my research for a specific company, that's when I would find out, okay, it's been through the fintech sandbox. So I think they are putting in some companies, but maybe they're just not being reported, or they're even failing, which is pretty common, you know, with startups. And then in terms of the challenges that I faced, I think they were more to do with just the complex payment gateway system in Zimbabwe, which I think we might touch on later. But yeah, I think there's definitely some hidden inconveniences trying to start a businesses in Zimbabwe, which, you know, in other countries, you're just worrying about, am I handling this for my customers? But in Zimbabwe, like entrepreneurs definitely have other challenges, you know, related to payment systems.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think one of the things that's unique about Zimbabwe is because in a way it's so difficult to access, and we should go on to that conversation soon. It's kind of cut off from a lot of innovation that could be expanded into Zimbabwe, but because it's so difficult to expand into Zimbabwe, it seems like there have been all these homegrown solutions. Like anyone who doesn't work in Zimbabwe may not know of any of the 4 players that you've listed. And so in order for any of those players to make sense in the market, because it's a kind of almost like an isolated market, they need to carve out a big enough market share for themselves in that market. And I imagine they're actually then quite aggressive about that market share and have very sharp elbows when it comes to new innovators in the space. And I wonder if there's maybe part of it being like, oh, we love innovation, but the reality is that actually in order for any of these 4 to thrive, they really need to push quite aggressively for market share. And I think, Nyasha, you said Umari has these incredibly discounted, almost free rates. You talked about heavily discounted rates for insurance, if I've understood correctly, and then very discounted rates for also, I think, for payment fees. And it sounds like that's kind of like a market grab situation. I don't know them well enough, but just from hearing you speak, that's what's evoked. I'm conscious of time. Do any of you 3 want to comment on anything else, whether it's Zimbabwean digital payments compared to other markets, or the evolution, or a couple of tips in terms of regulations that are coming about? Anything to kind of leave the audience with?
Sure. So I think I'll have just 2 points to add here. So I think this, more recent rise in innovative solutions has also opened gateways and increased access to services that previously weren't as accessible. So a good example is if you were trying to set up an e-commerce business in Zimbabwe, because EcoCash has over 6 million subscribers, you'd want to use EcoCash as a payment gateway. And getting access to that API for a very, very long time was difficult, very, very difficult. And in fact, that difficulty led to, I believe, the creation and rise of what I would say is the digital payment gateway in Zimbabwe, which is PayNow. But then also with the advent of Omari and Inbucks, we're seeing that API from EcoCash being more accessible. And I think Omari has been pushing for a very collaborative, shall I say, strategy around anybody who's trying to develop a solution, anybody who needs to integrate to facilitate payments internally. There is still a very significant challenge when it comes to trying to move that value or that money out of the Zimbabwean ecosystem for payments. And I think everybody is hopeful at the moment that the recent changes in the sanctions program instituted by the US would result or will result in certain services becoming accessible. Obviously, that is now a political conversation, and so we can't really rely on hope that will change. But I think that's kind of where the situation is. People really want to be able to access their PayPal balances. I know a lot of Zimbabweans who have either had their accounts closed because they try to figure out a way around it, maybe use a South African number to open an account, but then you can't move your money from there. So that's, I think, on the one. And the second part on the sandbox. I looked at a study that was run, I think it was done last year or the year before. And the participants in this survey, I think 48% of them that participated were actually software development companies and not financial services companies, which I think for me is very, very interesting. It's showing interest outside of the sector for people to develop solutions and be able to, to kind of take them up. How to apply is very simple. There is a site or a page on the RBZ website where you kind of go through the forms and you kind of submit. But I think a good number of comments that came out of that survey were the fact that there is very limited confidence in the RBZ's ability to manage the sandbox in itself. There were concerns, I think, around intellectual property and whether that will be handled very, very well. But I think the process to get access to it are quite straightforward. I'm not sure, and I can't comment as to what level of support you get once your application kind of goes through that process.
Yeah. And I just also wanted to add a couple of points there, but broadly looking at it in terms of an opportunity that exists in the market, that in as much as we've got all this that is happening in our market, our ecosystem is quite advanced when it comes to consumers' digital literacy. And by this, what I mean is, we've got a lot of digital transactions taking place, especially if people are transacting using the local currency. And I think we've also seen the regulator, relaxing import duties when it comes to point of sale machines. And I think if people are to go and look at the NPS report from the RBZ, there's steady growth in terms of the number of point of sales machine in Zimbabwe, the number of debit cards that are being issued, showing that people are actually transacting digitally. And that is actually, so digital literacy, we are advanced in that space. And on another part, comes back to an opportunity that exists, particularly when we look at our channel partners or channel distribution. So you would note that I think come 2020, mobile money agents were put at a halt for multiple reasons, especially currency trading. And then after that, the regulator then requires mobile money agents to be more stringent when it comes to the KYC or know your customer. And that change, in as much as it may affect access, but it's opening up opportunity for multiple other players, where if one operator was monopolizing the distribution network, now it's actually open for more people to begin to build their own distribution network when it comes to channel partners. So I think there's quite a number of opportunities that have been opened up due to legislation and also changes in regulation. So yeah, those are the 2 points I wanted to end.
Thank you very much. I think this segues nicely into the next topic, which is around remittances. And it was interesting. I think when we first started talking about like the second topic that we wanted to cover, I was quite keen on making it more around international payments because I've been working with South Africa for the past 15 years, and it has been a headache, to say the least. and one that is constantly evolving in different shapes as we have been sending money to Zimbabwe. But Dumi, then you opened my eyes to remittances going to Zimbabwe, the growth of remittances going to Zimbabwe, and how much those remittances make up in terms of the percentage of GDP of Zimbabwe compared to its regional peers. So would love to hear a little bit more from you about the remittances space, given that it's just, you can't look at international payments without looking at remittances.
Absolutely. No, thanks, Georgina. I think remittances are an important piece when it comes to digital financial services. And the reason is, the first part is you need to follow the money, and by following the money, any business, particularly if you're operating in Zimbabwe, you would want to see where do you have the USD access. And so if you've got access to that hard currency in digital financial services, remittances comes top of mind. And so if you look at that graph there, it's quite interesting to see where Zimbabwe sits when it comes to remittances as a percentage of GDP. We are hitting close to around about 11.5%, and this is based on World Bank data. And the follow on there, which is Ghana, is pretty much, at just over 6% of GDP contribution. And so this constitutes a huge part, and remittances are important for Zimbabwe. And there are multiple reasons why. And I know immigration is one of that. And I think Nigeria has managed to coin an interesting term, which they call JAPA. And in simple terms, people are running away and moving on to the West, or relocating to Europe, US, etc., to get work opportunities. And because of that, there's this massive drive to send money back home. And so if you look at this, if we go back to the actual figures for Zimbabwe to say how much is actually coming into the country, on an average, Zimbabwe, we are receiving about $100 million US every single month in inward remittances. And I think when we go back to 2020, that's the first time we hit $1 billion mark in remittances in Zimbabwe, and that has been on a constant growth. In fact, if we look at 2023, we are estimated to be sitting at close to $1.8 billion in international remittances. And so there has been that steady growth in remittances coming into the country. However, there's a question to then say, so what does this mean when it comes to innovation? What does this mean in terms of opportunity? And I think if we look at it from a first mile access, I think it's highly digitized. You've got players such as World Remit, Yomukuru, I think Ziki Cash, which Nyasha spoke to. EcoCash also has built multiple partnerships to support that. And so from a first mile, you're seeing money being sent digitally, but the moment it hits Zimbabwe, you've got two options. Either the money gets into your mobile money wallet, or you go and take it as cash, of which the majority, because of the lack of trust, which I think has been alluded to earlier on, people are willing to go and get the cash. And so they get their $100, their $50, they want to hold it as cash and spend it. So the last mile digitization is still a massive gap when it comes to remittances in the country. And the big question is, so where are these remittances going to, and what is the money being spent on? In fact, I think a third of the monthly remittances coming into the country, which is an estimated 150 million, is actually going into healthcare. And so healthcare, a lot of the money, people are sending money for medicines, hospital bills, etc., but not to ignore areas such as education, property development, construction. A lot is happening in that space. But as highlighted earlier, there's still a gap when it comes to last mile digitization. And I think in just concluding on giving a comparative view of where we sit from a sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to remittances versus venture capital investment. And I think, TK, you highlighted the issue of lack of capital. Nyasha, you also agreed to the same. If we go into 2022, 2023 figures, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, had an inward remittances estimated to be at $100 billion US. But guess what? Within the same period, startups in sub-Saharan Africa raised an estimated $6 billion US only, which is less than 10%. And so the big question is, to what extent can we actually leverage remittances or the diaspora to support venture capital investment into the region. And so we are seeing that as an opportunity that is lying there. And again, we are seeing a few partners. I think DABA is one of an interesting venture VC that is leveraging diaspora remittances to drive capital access. But yeah, I'll pause here and just open up for a discussion. But this is a brief overview of remittances. Thank you.
Thanks, Dumi. It's fascinating. And I'd actually love to center the discussion a little bit around harnessing some of this money, as you say, to go towards, I wouldn't say venture capital. I think there's venture capital has gotten this reputation that it's kind of like the savior for all startups, and it's always the best type of funding for all startups. And it's not, right? Like, I think what happens is if you don't actually have like a healthy VC ecosystem, for example, you might have a lot of Series A investors coming in, but then the VC model is one where the startups then usually have to raise Series B and Series C. And if there's not a developed ecosystem around that, then they die. And I think that's actually quite a common problem in Africa with VC funding, where you have this kind of valley of death. It happens in the West too, but I think it's especially prominent in Africa because it's at Series B, Series C that companies need to raise more funding. I think exit opportunity is a little bit more limited, and VC models typically don't invest in asset-heavy businesses. They're typically only investing in software models. So I think the question is, how can we better leverage the remittances inflows of capital into driving more homegrown innovation, and maybe the channel is start up capital instead of VC funding. Nyasha, I know that this was kind of, I think if I've understood correctly, this was kind of behind your idea when you set up Zenali. Do you have any views on that?
Yes, basically the remittance data that we've just discussed that Dumi was talking about, what it told me and my co-founder that I built Zenali with was there's a lot of migrant workers out there with disposable income. They are sending all these billions of dollars to their families. What if the money that they're sending, like Dumi was saying, can actually be channeled into sustainable growth? So the businesses in Zimbabwe, just to let you know how much capital they need, microfinance agencies, which my father works for one of them, the loans that they're giving these businesses are at sometimes 15% interest rates. That's like probably average. It can even go higher than that. And I know it sounds crazy for anyone in the diaspora because Americans are crying about 8% interest rates. But yeah, I digress. So basically exactly like I said, we saw that there was an opportunity. And for someone like me, working in New York, even if like the return wasn't like 15%, I think there is just like a level of fulfillment in being a part of, helping Zimbabwean businesses grow. So when we actually told some of the New Yorkers, we were at an event with about 20 Zimbabweans in New York, and we were telling them this idea that, look, there are very viable Zimbabwean businesses. There are a lot of opportunities. If they are pre-screened and we see that they have a lot of potential and they have a lot of promise, would you want to invest? They were very excited about the idea because, like I said, the level of fulfillment. So yeah, I think it's an exciting thing to think about how we can channel that same remittance disposable income to actually helping Zimbabwean businesses grow. And the question I think investors always have before they invest something is, okay, what is it even about? And what I've noticed with people who've asked for capital, we're just like, oh, can you put $300 into my business? I'm like, okay, what do you do? And they just tell me this story, and then there's no digital footprint. There's no website. They're probably registered. And I think as you're thinking, as an investor, you're more likely to go with a business that is formalized and bankable. So a solution like we have with Zenali is really encouraging this many SMEs, and they are employing a lot of people in the country. I think there's at least 80% of adults who are involved in some kind of SME. So there are a lot of people. If some of them formalize their businesses, I think it would do a lot to transform Zimbabwe into a middle income economy. I know it sounds like really, but it would really, I think giving people economic power is very powerful. And the last thing I want to say is that a great business isn't even like rocket science, like, oh, you have to be the smartest person or you have to do this. It's like when I was talking about Econet is not usually the first innovator of that product. I think they just have excellent leadership. They have a good digital footprint, great financial management. So sometimes just efficient business practices are not a lot to do with you coming up with this big thing that is impossible, but just focusing on your customers and doing great business. So I think it really encouraged whatever entrepreneurs are here on the school. I think they should be a lot because people are interested about the fintech sandbox. So I figured there are people who want to get in or something. But yeah, it's really encouraging for anyone starting a business that just formalize it, make it a great business. Investors are going to be interested, especially people in the diaspora.
And I'm wondering, how transparent is the whole remittances market? I've always thought about it as relatively intransparent, but now that it's much more, it's channeled via these digital solutions like World Remit, et cetera, I guess that's driving transparency in the market, it's driving accountability, it's driving liquidity, which is an opportunity for businesses, right? Like, I think it's very difficult to raise capital at an affordable rate if the investor knows nothing about that company. It's very difficult to keep in touch, and they don't know the risk profile, and they don't know the spending history, and they don't know how much liquidity is going to be in the market going forward, blah, blah, blah. The digitalization of all of this lowers that barrier. I'm wondering if any of you have any, and even if it's just a couple of ideas on new innovations in the space, because as I say, for me, my gut tells me that the remittances space is quite opaque, but actually maybe there's more transparency, and maybe through that transparency, there's an opportunity to harness.
Absolutely. I think there is definitely a massive opportunity there when it comes to transparency. And I think it comes back to the earlier point, which I also mentioned, which is the digitization of that last mile, which is still very much lacking, in my opinion, particularly when we look at how funds are then distributed, when they hit the country. And a lot of the operators that are currently there, they are actually finding ways to source cash to their outlets where the cash is being picked up from. And so if we talk of transparency, digitization is critical, because that will then enable that clear platform that is transparent, it's clear, and we're able to actually track usage of funds, etc. So I think just to pretty much I agree to the point you've raised, that is actually key.
We are almost at the hour, which is nuts. I have failed in my job as a moderator to pace this discussion. I apologize. And there are so many more questions that I wanted to ask all of you, but I am also conscious of time. To wrap up, is there anything that any of the three of you would like to share with the audience today?
Let me go first. I was actually going to say, Nyasha, you need to hook me up. I need to know who's giving loans at 15%, because the interest rates that I've seen, once you compute them in the market, they're wild. But also to your point,
like, it's actually low. 15% is very low.
It's great. It's amazing. I need to know. But yeah, I think just to wrap up a couple of thoughts here. I think what you have in Zimbabwe is a growing population of economically active people who are interested in accessing services. They are trading in crypto. They are trading on the local stock exchange, on the Victoria Falls stock exchange, which is denominated in US dollars. And they are used to understanding and transacting in US dollars, both in cash and trying to move that money online, and vice versa. And so to anybody who's looking at the space, I think it is ripe for innovation. Yes, we should find innovative ways of moving diaspora remittances to these investments, but I think more importantly, we need to see those who are in the diaspora who have access and exposure to come in and help structure some of these innovations. That money needs to come with a lot of insight and a lot of guidance. I think in Zimbabwe, we have one angel network, if I'm not mistaken, that's at least publicly known, as in that is invested in startups. And so I think that in and of itself is quite critical. Simply funneling the money will result in very big catastrophes, which we will all blame on, harsh economic environments. When in reality, it's simply that guidance in how to build a functional business. And Nyasha, I think you pointed to this. It's not rocket science to build a functional and profitable business. So we need to make sure that the ways that we're directing those investments also come in with that structure and that guidance. I think there is an economic opportunity in doing so, in fixing the broken value chain, as you pointed out, Georgina.
Thank you very much, TK. Nyasha, Dumi, any closing thoughts?
Sure. I think from my end, it's really to say there's a huge opportunity in the country. I mean, it's difficult to do business in Zimbabwe, but I think when it comes to digital financial services, there's a massive opportunity that is existing in the market. We've highlighted a couple of those, cutting across remittances, digitization of specific value chains, and for ecosystem builders, to what extent can we actually begin to play a role when it comes to aligning some of the broken value chain components. So I think there's a huge, massive opportunity, but come prepared to be able to do cartwheels while holding a glass of water to be able to do that. But I think regardless, there's a massive opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dumi. Nyasha?
Yeah, I just want to say that we talked about a trust currency on this platform. I also just want to talk about a network currency. So you showing up, the people who are in the audience, who you showing up to events like this, you're definitely building up on your network currency, which might even be more important than being the straight A student who gets, all the results. So I think keep doing what you're doing, stay engaged, and, being in communities like this is very helpful. At least for me, knowing people or just connecting with people has been very useful in my career. So I just want to encourage people generally to continue doing that.
More coordination. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for today. I am quickly going to share the last slide, which is just, we haven't talked about ZOF Africa, but we, as I said at the beginning, ZOF Africa is a volunteer-run organization that is funding incredibly ambitious and incredibly bright students, all from low-income backgrounds, in the fields of technology and leadership. So if you want to support us in any way, please do. All donations go directly towards our wonderful students in Zimbabwe. And we are a US and UK registered charity. Thank you everyone for today. And thank you panelists. This was an incredibly rich discussion. Thank you very much for your time.